Hello and welcome. The Purdue Institute for the Study of the Iranian World welcomes you to another episode of our podcast, Legacies of Ancient Persia. Join us as we further explore the many legacies of ancient Persia and its relevance to global patrimony. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Legacies of Ancient Persia. This week, our guest is Dr. David Potter, a professor of classics at the University of Michigan. In this episode, we discuss the intriguing figure of Empress Theodora, the perceptions of the Sasanians by the Romans, and the complex relations and the greatest lessons we can learn from the two ancient empires. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give our show a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I've been really looking forward to this conversation. So I want to start us off and just ask you, how did you get into the field of classics?
I had some terrific teachers in high school, and that encouraged me to continue in college, where again, was fortunate to have some excellent teachers. So that's why I'm here today.
And I mean, there's so much in classics. So how did you choose your specialty?
Well, it began with an interest in Gibbon's history of the later Roman Empire. And I took a wonderful course on Gibbon while I was in college, taught by Glenn Bowersock. And this got me very interested in the history of the 3rd century, which I could see was problematic. And I found a document that nobody had paid very much attention to called the 13th Sibylline Oracle, which is the only contemporary Western account of Rome's dealings essentially with Persia in the course of the middle of the 3rd century. So I wrote a dissertation on it.
Wow. I mean, that's fascinating just for people who aren't really familiar with that. Can you tell us, how does it relate to Persia?
Well, what the 13th Sibylline Oracle is an ex post facto prediction of the history of Rome from the point of view of people living in Syria from roughly 240 to the triumph of Odenathus in the early 260s. So it gives us a lot of direct information about the sort of crisis between Rome and Persia in that period. It introduces us to the figure of Mariades, the Syrian brigand who acted as a guide for Sapor. It gives us a reaction to Sapor's capture of the Emperor Valerian. It casts a glance or two at the fate of people like the Emperor Decius against the Goths. But it really is very much of a document that's focused in Syria. And that becomes very clear at the end, where Odenathus is identified as the lion sent from the sun to come and save everybody from the horrible Persian.
What a document. I mean, this is quite interesting. So you've essentially said that, yes, you dove right into the 3rd century. You've explored this fascinating period where you have all these conglomerations of different cultures. I did see somewhere that you have written, though, on the origins of Rome as well. So I'm so curious, how did you go from starting with the later Roman Empire to going back to the origins?
I've taught quite a few history courses on the history of Rome, and a course often on the history of ancient warfare, which ends really with Caesar's Gallic Wars. I was always very interested in Polybius. And so it's a course that is, you should read all the sort of hits, Herodotus, Thucydides, Polybius, and Caesar. And so that gave me the background to try to write a history of Rome from the Republic, from the middle of the Republic onwards, because it really covered material I taught all the time.
Oh, wow. I mean, that's just so cool. I feel like I don't know of many people who would tackle a culture with a very long history that spans so many different centuries. So that's pretty impressive. Now, I also saw somewhere that you have written on the Empress Theodora. Is that correct?
Yes, that was a fascinating project for me. I suppose I was asked to take it up because, among other things, I also teach courses on Roman public entertainment. And Theodora's early career as an actress, I think, made people want to ask me to write this book. I mean, it's a very difficult subject because you have to disentangle the career of this absolutely fascinating person, a very clearly brilliant personality, from all of the nasty slanders that were composed by Procopius about her. And we do have much more favorable accounts of Theodora in Syriac texts that enable us to sort of get away from what Procopius, who clearly just couldn't stand her, wrote about her. But also, we do know a fair amount about the structure of the entertainment industry. We know what it would have been like for her to make her way in the world as a young woman, a talented actress, but also somebody who was very dependent for her welfare on the men that she could meet. And Justinian was certainly not the first man in her life, but once they were together, it was clearly a real partnership in the management of the empire. And one certainly gets the sense that so long as Theodora was around, things went pretty well. After her death, I think we see a lot less energy in the regime of Justinian. So she was just an intriguing person to get to know.
I recently read the new Justinian biography by Peter Sarris, and I was shocked how much of Theodora was in there, but also very pleased. And so, as someone who's also written on her sort of her career, especially beforehand, one thing that I think I definitely was a bit caught off guard by was just how different these differing accounts of her have turned out. So, as you were doing research for this book, I'm just wondering, how did you go about sort of trying to actually build a picture of her when you have such differing accounts? Because some are so complimentary and some are just kind of completely terrible.
Well, it is possible to reconstruct some moments of Theodora's career with quite a good deal of detail. One of these is with the aid of John Maliolus, who is far more favorable to her than Procopius. And that enables us to see who her supporters were in the palace, how she was able to sort of create a situation where she could get rid of a very powerful member of the court who she clearly couldn't stand, John the Cappadocian. Also, we have a very extensive narrative of the Nika revolt, where again we can get a sense for what she is doing, how she really basically told Justinian, "This is it. You're going to have to no running away. You're going to have to put an end to this thing." So we can, with the aid of these instances, get an idea of what her influence was. With the aid of some accounts of some Syriac texts, again we can see her interacting with people in the Monophysite movement who saw her as their protector. So it's a bit of like putting together a puzzle, but there are enough pieces there, I think, to give us a pretty good idea of how she did actually operate within the imperial system. And it does look like if you wanted to thrive in the court of Justinian, you'd better get along well with the empress. Peter Sarris's book, I think, is very, very good. And I think he does a very good job of using legal texts, which, as he rightly sees, are directly influenced by Justinian to recreate the character of this man. And I think as one moves through Peter Sarris's book, you also get a sense that the practical person here is not Justinian.
That definitely did come through in his early descriptions and characterizations. So yeah, I really hate to admit, but I suppose it's, but I didn't really know a lot before that book. Also, I didn't really think about learning more because I was like, yeah, she's interesting, but I want to learn about the emperors. But after reading through the book, I definitely found myself taking a much greater interest in the person of Theodora herself. Now, a lot of these accounts that you've just mentioned obviously are kind of local. They were there. They sort of were writing based on kind of their perception of her, whether you supported her or not. I am curious, though, do we have accounts from places further afield or even neighboring empires that describe her at all that might sort of be completely different from the sources we have who were kind of there close to everything?
Well, the sort of furthest I think that we can get from Theodora is John of Ephesus, who, as a Monophysite, is taking a very different view of her than we would get from a more conventionally placed person like a Procopius, like a John Malimus, who's clearly using contemporary texts from Constantinople. We don't really get any visions of Theodora from the Gothic world or the world of the Vandals, and we don't really hear anything from the Persian Empire about Theodora. So we're really dependent upon our Byzantine texts. But I think it's also useful to see that we have three completely different perspectives between Procopius, John Malimus, and John of Ephesus. And also, there are some moments that one suspects one can feel the hand of Theodora behind some of the legal utterances of her husband.
She's so fascinating. I could go on, but I do want to turn us a bit to another figure who the Persians would have perhaps had a lot more up close and personal experience with, General Belisarius, because he was off kind of fighting them here and there throughout his career. Now we have a ton of Roman sources, obviously. The Justinian book even sort of talked about Justinian's reaction to things that were happening, where he was sending him. And it talked a little about the relations, fraught relations with Persia. But obviously, it's not just one-sided. There is a whole nother side to this for what's going on. And I'm just curious to see. I've not had the opportunity to look into sort of differing opinions of people like Belisarius outside of the Roman sources. So I'm curious, what are other people saying about him? Because I basically only know what's happening from Justinian's end.
Well, that is really the picture we get because he was Procopius's boss. A great deal of the history of the wars, there's more about Belisarius in the history of the wars than there is about Justinian. And, it's very much in Procopius's line that Belisarius was a military genius and a great figure who was treated badly in the end by Justinian. And clearly, Belisarius was a very able general. I mean, his management of the campaign against the Vandals was really very impressive. The earlier campaigns against Persia, on the one hand, he wins the Battle of Dara, but the Battle of Callinicum is interesting because he loses control of the army and suffers quite a serious defeat on that occasion. And then later, when he's recalled, I think the sign that he is actually a very good general is he knows how to fight more than one kind of battle. And in his final campaigns, Byzantine army clearly was not at that point up to a straight up confrontation with the Persian army. So Belisarius was able to contain Persian offensives without putting an army at risk. And that, I think, in some ways is his best generalship.
There's so much to dig in there. But one thing that I really wanted to make sure I had time to ask you about is I saw that, I believe it was in 2021 or 22, that you gave a talk for the Porta Vute Institute about the Western sources for the Sasanians. And since this is all happening kind of around the time of Justinian and a little before and after, obviously. But one of the things, right, is that we have a ton of Greco-Roman sources talking about the Sasanians. And just to kind of set us up in context, we have distinctive pictures painted by whatever empire you're looking at and their sort of biased sources painting these interesting pictures. Obviously, when thinking about Greco-Roman sources, historically, you think of the Persian Wars, you have the Persians sort of described as barbarians. They wear pants and do all this stuff. So by the time you get to the Sasanians and you have the Byzantines kind of in place, I'm just curious, like, how has the perception
shifted, or has it shifted from kind of what we had back then?
Well, that's a real problem when you start looking at the Roman accounts of the Sasanians, because they did not want to really admit that there had been serious changes of regime. Now, there is a tendency in the sort of classicizing habit of Roman historians to turn everybody into the descendants of the Achaemenids. And probably the worst version of this is Ammianus Marcellinus's description of Persia, where he leaves the Arsacids out altogether. And he really doesn't. The odd thing is he knew a lot about the eastern frontier because he'd been on campaign there. He'd fought against the Persians a number of times himself. He had a friend who was a satrap in the border regions. But as a historian, when he's going to describe Persia, he sort of throws everything he really knows out the window and goes back and pulls up a very traditional account of Persian habits. And there are moments in Procopius as well where, on the one hand, when he's describing a Persian army moving into the Roman Empire, etc., he can do a pretty good job. But there are other places where he makes mistakes when he tries to write about the internal history of the Sasanians. Quite often he gets things wrong. So then we have the missing, or is it partially preserved, historians of the earlier period, a number of whom do give us some very interesting pictures of Persia, some of whom, of course, have direct evidence from people who've been on embassies to Persia. So, we can piece together a picture of the Sasanian regime on the basis of, accounts of embassies and things like that, while leaving out the sort of broader, more broadly based, heavily classicizing descriptions of Persia. But of course, again, as the evidence, what sets our understanding of Persia and Rome apart from our understanding of Roman relations in so many other places is that we do have very significant Iranian evidence for the Sasanians, which does give us a very interesting, very different picture of who they were, where they came from, how they related to the Iranian past. We can see how they essentially pulled together an alliance of the noble Iranian houses, replacing the Arsacids, who had done the same thing with themselves. And again, one of the curiosities, as we can see, is it's not just Ammianus who wants to get the poor old Parthians out of the history of Iran. The Sasanians do a pretty good job of that themselves.
Man, history is complicated. Well, one thing that really pops up in my mind is I know the Romans like to think of themselves kind of obviously as the preeminent, the best empire that was around. Sort of no one really was up to snuff with them. Clearly, we have a ton of evidence, right, thinking that the Greeks sort of looked down on them. Now, by this period of time, though, the Iranian Empire was nothing to sniff at. And so one thing that I would love to know is, did the Romans ever get to a point where they could acknowledge that, well, the Sasanian Empire was kind of like an equal to them, and they weren't somehow inferior? Was it the size of it? Was it just the increasing complex relations between the two? Was it a combination of factors?
Well, on a good day when the two sides were getting along, the Romans would essentially admit equality with the Persian kings were on an equal status with themselves. And we have letters that are quoted, for instance, by Ammianus Marcellinus, where the Persian king, and the Roman emperor are two equals who are able to talk to each other. And so, it is the case that the Romans recognized the Persian Empire as being an equal to themselves. They don't like to do it, but in negotiating with the Persians, they do have to. And I think they also recognized that the Persians had many of the same problems they did, and that the Caucasus frontier, the Central Asian frontier of the Persian Empire, was to the Persians, and the Romans understood this very much as the Danubian frontier was to the Romans, that you're dealing with people who are simply very hard to deal with. And obviously, when the kings of Persia say, if you don't want the Huns to come, you've got to pay us so we can defend the passes. Gets to be a certain amount of tension for the Romans. Is the money that we're sending them tribute, or is it a contribution so that both of us don't have to deal with these people? And one of the things that we can see the Romans doing is flip-flopping back and forth between supporting the Persians' efforts in the Central Asian frontier and other times sending embassies to people in Central Asia saying, hey, why don't you attack the Persians? So it just between two powers, I think this is one of the things that's very interesting. There's always an inherent sense of competition that they never really get away from. And I think it's something that we need to learn from, that if you maintain this perspective of constantly adversarial relationship, even in times of peace, that you're never going to get away from the potential for violent conflict.
I think it's a very valuable lesson, and it's learning more about the relations between the Roman Empire and the Sasanians definitely can offer some interesting clues about how do or can two sort of global powers who are just as large and sophisticated, how can you really coexist? And it definitely makes me think of, what kind of big countries does the US compete with? And are we coexisting, but like in that sense, or are we trying to gain some advantage to say, no, we're all equal, but like, hey.
Yeah, it's a real problem. And I think that it hasn't been helped by the tendency of some political scientists to misread and misinterpret Thucydides. Pride of place, of course, always goes to Graham Allison's Thucydides trap, which is a total misreading of Thucydides. And that if you were instead of saying there's an ascending and descending power and there'll be an inevitable conflict between them, the point we really need to take away from Thucydides is that two political systems that don't trust each other are going to fall into conflicts. And essentially, as Thucydides says, because the Spartans and the Athenians are not capable of talking to each other, there's instant or immediate distrust, and that can lead to a conflict that really has no purpose at all. I mean, the first 10-year war, first part of the Peloponnesian War that Thucydides describes are really two sides posturing at each other with no clear plan for how they're going to win. And if it wasn't for the intervention of the Persians in the final phase of the war, the whole thing would have just, again, ended with the Athenians and the Spartans sitting there saying, we hate each other.
That makes me think of it as like they were propagating the original culture war over nothing.
Yeah, no, that absolutely is it. And so if there's a failure to try to engage with another power and understand in its own terms, you're left with the probability of conflict. And even as the Romans, could try to understand the Persians, the tendency of the Romans to try to paint on a good day, we understand what's going on here. On a bad day, they're the descendants of Xerxes, and we have been at war with, there's been a conflict between our world and their world from the earliest time, and we are simply acting here in the grand tradition of Themistocles and Alexander the Great. And again, it's just a very unhealthy way of negotiating.
Man, the ancient world still offering such valuable lessons, and this is why I love studying history, because truly, I feel like there's nothing that I feel at least that there's nothing today that I feel like humans in general have not sort of come up against, but I feel like we sort of misinterpret ancient sources or just ignore them sometimes. Yeah, we should stop doing that. But I do want to make sure that I have time to ask you about Curso, the emperor there. I don't know much about him, and for those in the audience who may know his name, know that he was kind of the historic adversary to Justinian. Can you tell us a little bit about what Curso was doing?
What we can see with Curso is that he found the Romans at a moment of political instability, and he thought he could take great advantage of it. In the end, what we have are two narcissists fighting with each other in Heraclius and Khosrow. And I think that what Khosrow could never really do is see that the resources that were available to him were actually insufficient to for taking over the Roman Empire. That he had to work with an army of a certain size, which was the army that he could raise in Persia, and that could not successfully occupy the Roman Empire, even if large numbers of people were happily surrendering. It wasn't a large enough force to be able to capture Constantinople. And he is outmaneuvered in the end by Heraclius, and he's caught in the wrong place. But when you look at his memorials to himself in Persia, you can see that clearly he had a very high impression of himself. And, as we look today, problematic leadership, and especially narcissistic leadership, is marked by an inability to understand what the limits are on the exercise of power. And certainly Khosrow suffered from that. And really, so did Heraclius. Heraclius's rebuilt version of the Roman Empire. And you read George of Pisidia, Heraclius, the Superman who wins the war. Clearly, Heraclius liked listening to that. But at the same time, he couldn't reunite his own empire in a way that could manage the rise of Islam.
I find him fascinating, but also just not only because of the sort of attempted elimination of Rome, which was an interesting decision, but also because when looking at kind of a dangerous gambit like this, but also then considering, what are the relations like between the two before you decide to try to conquer somebody. I actually don't remember if this was still going on in this period of history. So actually, let's back up for 2 seconds and let me ask, I know that somewhere in the grand scheme of timelines, there was thought to be an exchange between Rome and the Persians sending kind of, what was it? Either like children of aristocrats or royals themselves to kind of do an exchange in each other's empires. Maybe I'm making that up.
Well, Khosrow was actually a hostage in Byzantium when Maurus then put him on the throne of Persia. And so initially, of course, it looked like Maurus had, as it were, made the Persian regime completely dependent upon himself. But then when he is assassinated, again, it's a political instability of the Roman Empire that offers an opening to Khosrow and said, well, after all, the man who just murdered my benefactor is the person with whom I'm going to go to war. So I'm in the right here. And I think that he also may have had a sense that the Roman regime was going to be in a state of disorder, which indeed it proved to be.
Okay. Yeah, because I think I sort of wondered for a while now, like, because he was a hostage, like, is that essentially what also made him not look generously when, some sources, I guess, could have said, oh, no, it's a friendly exchange of just having them there versus, no, they're actual prisoners, like politicals.
Well, there was also a question on the Roman side. It was obvious that there was no heir to the Emperor Maurus who survived and went to Persia. They were obviously going to deny that. But I do occasionally think that what Khosrow is doing at the beginning of the war is essentially trying to repay the favor that was done to him. And then I think what we can see is it begins to get out of hand, and his ambitions become far greater than he had the capacity to realize.
I mean, because all this is happening, obviously each empire goes through its own period of instability. Now, I am aware that at some point, the Romans or Byzantines at this point, they do start to take a greater level of interest, let's say, in the internal affairs of their neighbors, trying to see, okay, what's going on? Is there an opening for us? And out of curiosity, was there that same sort of level of interest shown by their rivals kind of down? Obviously, we have the Persians next door, but obviously in North Africa, I know we have a lot of internal conflict and rebellion as well. So is that reflected that we see not only Rome having an interest in other people's internal affairs, but sort of the same?
The relationship between Rome and the Western states is really very different. None of the successor kingdoms to the Western regime were really powerful enough to take on the empire of, from Justinian to Heraclius. Obviously, in the wake of the Islamic conquest, the power is equalized between the Western European states and the Roman Empire. But up until the beginning of the 7th century, really what people looked to Constantinople for were handouts. The difficulty with the Western European states was they weren't really strong enough to take on directly the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire often looked to manage them through handouts. It was, after all, Theodoric was supported in his takeover of Italy by the court in Constantinople. The court in Constantinople, after initial failed conflicts with the Vandals, would again try to manipulate the internal politics of the North African state. It was always a sort of top-down relationship between Rome and the successor states of the West, which was very different from the one-to-one relationship, as it were, with Persia. The same thing is what we find in the Danube, is they're constantly trying to manipulate the leadership of the different groups north of the Danube, because they certainly are not going to admit any sense of equality. And they often see them as a source of employees, that these are people who are going to send us new mercenaries and we're going to use them in the army, and that's fine. We don't ever sense that in Rome's relationship with Persia.
Such a long period of history. I mean, so many things change. It's just so fascinating to hear kind of how perspectives and other things change, relations change. I mean, there's so many changes. This is good. Yeah, it's fascinating. Now, one thing I would like to be able to ask is, like, in terms of sort of, I guess we can call them stereotypes, but not even, it's like beyond stereotypes. It's like perceptions. Since obviously the Sasanians were around for a very long time and spanned many different emperors and decades right alongside the Roman Empire, I'm just curious if, like, is there a marked perception change maybe on the side of the Persians toward the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire as sort of they deviate more? I mean, obviously during the reign of Justinian, he tried his best to try to conquer and keep them together. But after you definitely get this sort of deviation, did they look at them differently, or were they all just Roman, not even East and West?
I think that the Sasanians simply saw them as Roman. At the point when they're dealing with the united Roman Empire, as it were, in terms of negotiation, I mean, I suppose the most interesting line is actually in Sapor's Naqsh-e-Rustam inscription, where he lists, all of the Western peoples who gather together and they're part of the army of Valerian. And I think that tells us as much as anything about the way that the Sasanians saw the Roman Empire as this collection of foreigners.
I mean, keeping it simple, that's probably the best way to put it. I mean, I guess don't overcomplicate where you needn't do that.
Yeah.
One thing I would like to get to, just for funsies, is I don't feel like I see a lot of media done on the Sasanians, sort of media project. I mean, obviously we have popular media more around the Achaemenids, 300, might I mention, but we don't really get anything, or that I've seen at least, really on the Sasanians. And I think that there's so much rich history and material that you could do something great about the Sasanian and Byzantine conflicts. So I'm curious, is there something maybe that I'm just not familiar with or I'm overlooking? But if there isn't, what's something you think would make for a great film or TV show that we could do to sort of educate people more about this great period of history?
Well, you need to have a character who will grab people's attention. And Theodora would be my hero for that. And if you were to make a movie about Theodora, that would automatically involve you in looking at the Sasanian Empire, relationships between Constantinople and Ctesiphon. And I think that would be maybe the best way to bring people's attention to this period. And I think if you wanted to do it otherwise, probably to make some kind of sort of Khusru, as a version of the 300, you could possibly do that. But I think you'd get a much more interesting story if you began with Theodora. And you could even, while she spent some time in Antioch before she married Justinian, you might even be able to invent some extra connections between herself and the empire to the east.
Okay. Although I'm almost curious, why not just do something on Justinian? Because I feel like no one has really taken Justinian and done anything with him.
They haven't, but Justinian, was around for a long time. And my own sense, possibly sense on the basis of my own experience writing about Theodora, is that Theodora is in many ways a very vivid character with whom people could relate. And I think that Sarris's book, Many Merits, also suggests to you why it would be very difficult to make a movie about the highly bureaucratic, extremely pious, very bossy Justinian. Theodora is a much easier person to deal with.
That's true. Although I think I'd enjoy watching someone attempt to take on a portfolio as big as Justinian's. I mean, I'm just thinking like, oh yeah, I could see them doing kind of an HBO Rome treatment to it where you have your Justinian and he's like the workaholic who always works away in his office, and then you could almost do a touch of comedy if you wanted to. I feel like we could do this comedic thing where actually you don't see him, you just see the door to like whatever study he's in, and then essentially you could have Theodore or somebody sort of come up to the door, essentially sometimes go in, come out, but you never see him, but you just see it like an ever-growing stack of papers essentially emerge and say, okay, now we do this, and now we do this, to show kind of how prolific he was in writing all those laws and other sort of things. So I think you could put a touch of comedy in that, and I think it'd be quite funny.
That would be, if you could do a comedy of Justinian, I think that would be, a set of Monty Python's version of Justinian.
I would love that. You know what? I would really, really love that. So I hope someone in Hollywood hears this and decides, let's take on a comedy of Justinian and Theodora. Because otherwise, I think my only other option would be maybe Belisarius, maybe do something with him.
Well, again, movies about war heroes, you could do that. And you could probably do that pretty well.
Yeah, and then you get all of him sort of popping over to Persian territory, starting stuff. You could again sort of make that comical. He pops over, he pops back, over and back. We could do a lot with that. Come on, Hollywood. We have things we could do. Yeah. Oh man. I mean, this period just offers such an opportunity, such a rich opportunity to do something fantastic. I guess the other thing I really wanted to ask about before I run out of time here is, obviously the Persian Empire stretches way into a lot of Central Asian countries, and their influence does spread not only through the Persian Empire, but back into Rome. Well, Byzantium, I should say. But I guess my impression of them is that they are only really called on if needed for a certain conflict. Otherwise, they're kind of just chilling. But we also have evidence, like material evidence of sort of influence and things going back and forth. So what were they actually doing? Were they kind of left alone until they were called upon, or were things actually happening?
Well, the various states of Central Asia did, of course, form a bridge between Iran and China. And so I think, again, our difficulty is that we only see them through the eyes of the Chinese, who sort of weren't that interested in them, or of the Iranians, who were very concerned with them, because this is an army largely of cavalry. It moves very quickly. They may not be any good at besieging cities, but they're very dangerous in the open. And the conflicts that we have described between the Sasanians and the peoples of Central Asia tend to be, very evenly matched. So I think that the one thing that And when the Romans occasionally send embassies to Central Asia saying, why don't you, here's some money, why don't you go attack the Sasanians? It's unfortunate that we don't have a really easy way of seeing them through their own eyes. And we can see them as sort of the liminal menace in the eyes of the Romans or the Sasanians.
What an interesting idea. I never would have thought to put together the words liminal menace, but I love it. So now I want to use this all the time for sort of cultures on the periphery of two great powers. Liminal menace. Thank you. I'm going to take that. I'm going to use it in the future, I think. Yeah. So before we get to the last couple of questions I have here, I did want to ask, what are you currently working on? And in case people would like to follow your work, see what you've been working on, and potentially the new things that you will be working on.
Well, my most recent book is a book on disruption, or how to foul up the world from Constantine to Trump. That came out a couple of years ago. And as a sort of complement to it, I've just finished a biography of Julius Caesar, which I hope will be out next year. And I think I'd like to think it stands apart from other books about Caesar in that it takes Caesar's own writing very seriously as a clue to his character. And we can meet a man who was an absolutely obsessive manager and get to see what made him work, why he was successful, and ultimately why he was not. So if you want to know how to manage things with Julius Caesar, read my book.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to go run and find it then. Also, it's interesting. It just occurred to me. I'm like, oh, that's another historical figure who was held hostage at some point. What is it with people being taken hostage and then suddenly getting the urge to conquer everyone?
Yeah.
Interested in learning more about the wonders of ancient Persia? Visit the UCLA Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran. The Gazetteer digitally preserves famous locations, World Heritage sites, and lesser-known areas from all time periods of ancient Iranian history. You can explore using the interactive map, or visit the encyclopedic catalog for updates to the ever-growing list of archaeological sites. Visit www.irangazetteer.ucla.edu and learn more about what the Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran has to offer.
Now, the sort of last thing I have is I end the episodes with two final questions. And there's no right or wrong answer. You can take this however you'd like. The first question is, what, in your opinion, is the greatest legacy left to us from ancient Persia?
I think that the greatest legacy from Persia is probably the visions of Zoroaster. And they've had a lot of impact outside of Persia, shaping Manichaeism, that we still can feel the impact of the sort of dualistic religion. And I suppose if Zoroaster was here today, he would be a perfect observer of American politics.
Hard to argue with that, definitely. And so the second question I have is, what do you think would be the best legacy that we ourselves as scholars can leave for future students of Iranian studies?
I think that the most important legacy we might have is to get people to understand what happens when different societies can't see each other for what they are and insist upon, as the Romans did with the Persians, painting them as somebody completely different and as a permanent rival, how that eliminates the possibility for a peaceful coexistence.
So elegantly put and so true. A little scary, actually, but that's definitely, I think, something very important that we definitely should do. I don't know how. I don't know the best way, but definitely agree with the sentiment.
I think if we keep the problem before our eyes, we can realize how we have to deal with it.
Perfect. Well, the last thing I'm going to ask really is if people would like to reach out to you, contact you with questions, or if there's some students who may want to inquire about classes or anything else, where can people reach you?
They can just reach me through the Department of Classical Studies at Michigan and my email address.
Perfect. And do you have an academia page?
Yes, I do.
Perfect. Well, I will link it in the show notes, and I will also include your university email and possibly the faculty page, just so everyone can go forth and see all the publications you've been on and any other projects. So with that, I would like to just really thank you so much for joining me. I had a ton of questions. I know I probably have 50 more that I could come up with, but this was such a pleasure.
Well, thank you very much. It was my pleasure to talk to you.
Legacies of Ancient Persia is a Portavood podcast production, hosted and edited by Lexi Henning, with select episodes co-hosted by Marissa Stevens. Cover art provided by Hadley Leesman and original music by Brent Arhart. Established in 2017 as the premier research center for the study of ancient Iran, the mission of the Portavood Institute for the Study of the Iranian World is to engage in transformative research on all aspects of Iranian antiquity, including its reception in the medieval and modern periods, by expanding on the traditional domains of old Iranian studies and promoting cross-cultural and interdisciplinary scholarship. Thanks for listening to our show. It's available to stream on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Portavood Institute and at Portavood UCLA, or visit our website, portavood.ucla.edu. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review us. For podcast inquiries or questions about the Portavood Institute, please email us at portavoodpodcastproduction@gmail.com. We'll see you next time as we continue our deep dive into the legacies of ancient Persia.